Hi guys, my name is Jesus Rodriguez and this is Orinoco Tribune interviewing Ben Norton from the Grayzone. And we wanted to talk with him about the Grayzone itself, what they do here, what their plans are. But also I want to hear his impressions about these latest visits that brought him to Venezuela, and also I want him to talk about the the new trends, the new media trends that he see in the horizon when we talk about progressive movements, about Venezuela, and about Latin America in general. So welcome, Ben, and thank you for accepting the invitation and for helping us with all the equipment for the interview. And the mic is
Of
yours.
course. Thanks. No, thanks for having me. And I wanted to say, both to him, but also to anyone watching, that Orinoco Tribune is a really useful website. A lot of really good resources. So everyone should thank him for providing this important perspective in English, because I'm not in any way saying that the media here in Spanish is bad. There's a lot of really good independent and government-backed media here that is helping to provide the perspective of Venezuelans that is ignored. This perspective is ignored in U.S. corporate media, but it's so important in English because there are so many people outside of Venezuela who are interested in what's going on and don't speak Spanish. So Orinoco Tribune has been a great resource to help people understand what's actually happening.
Thank you for the propaganda. Can you talk to us a little bit about what are you doing right now? I mean, the origins of the Grayzone, how you came up with the idea of the Grayzone, a little bit on the background of you and Max and the other two guys that were with you there, and what your plans are. Talk us a little bit about that.
Great. Yeah, the Grayzone was founded by Max Blumenthal in to the beginning of 2016. So it's still pretty new. And it's now the Grayzone, but it was called the Grayzone Project because it was a project of Alternet. Alternet, which technically still exists, is a progressive website based in the U.S., although it recently got bought by a rich Hillary Clinton supporter who laid everyone off and turned it into a front for Raw Story, which is this clickbait liberal website. So it doesn't really exist anymore. And when that happened, we got pushed out, and Max went independent. And the Grayzone is just now the Grayzone. It's independent. We have our own website. And there's 4 of us. It's a very small operation. Max and I were the first 2 people, and a team of great freelancers. And then now we also work with Aaron Mate, who is a really good journalist who launched a show, and also with Anya Parampol. And yeah, they're all great. But yeah, Anya's awesome, and got a big fan here. And what's incredible about that, I'm not in any way trying to toot our own horn here, but we actually have so many fans in Latin America, way more than in the U.S., which is actually really gratifying for me because, in the U.S., of course, we're trying to win a lot of people over, but it's the U.S. It's more gratifying for me to build community with people.
Because we in Orinoco Tribune are trying to do the same, but in the contrary. You know what you just said about, providing information. My idea is not to, gain audience in Venezuela, because what we want to do in Orinoco Tribune is project outside Venezuela news and articles that usually got lost in not translation, and no one knows exactly what is happening in Venezuela from a progressive perspective, of course, or what is the Chavista debate, and I believe that you are trying, maybe somehow you are
Very similar, exactly. It's important to build these international networks, and that's why it's great that we can collaborate here. And I'll say the original goal behind the Grayzone, it was always, of course, independent investigative journalism. And when Max founded it, one of the main goals was focusing on the so-called war on terror, which was always fake. I mean, it was never really a war against... Exactly. This nebulous concept. And in fact, the U.S. has supported many of these so-called terrorist groups for many years. And at first he focused, and then we focused a lot on things like the war in Syria, the dirty war in Syria, the aftermath of the war in Libya, which destroyed the Libyan state, unleashed a massive refugee crisis, created the world's largest open-air slave markets in Libya, things like that, issues that were being ignored by mainstream corporate media. And of course that also relates to the war in Yemen, Israel-Palestine, and increasingly Latin America. And the thing is...
So at the beginning you were focusing mostly in Middle East.
Well, yes, but I would say the focus has always been on the U.S. national security state and U.S. imperialism. And the thing is, in my view, maybe this could be argued in different ways, but in my view, the Obama administration's primary focus in terms of its foreign policy, the main focus was the Middle East. The war on Libya, the war in Syria, the war in Yemen, the so-called Arab Spring, and the attempts at regime change. And of course, there was this pivot to Asia, which is leading up to this new Cold War against China, which began really with Obama and has been expanded a lot under Trump. But so a lot of our work was focused on the Middle East because that's where the U.S. government was focused. But I think for a variety of reasons, the Trump era, it isn't that different, honestly, from the Obama era. And it's not just me saying that. In fact, there are several former members of the Obama administration who have said that the Trump administration's foreign policy is more continuity than change. The Trump administration has all of these neocons now, like John Bolton. So if anything, it's kind of the Obama era's foreign policy on steroids, and which is the Bush administration's foreign policy. There's a continuity. It's not just Obama. It's a bipartisan foreign policy consensus. And that's what the Grayzone has dedicated itself to, debunking to...
But in recent months, Latin America has been like the focus, right, or not?
Yeah, when...
I'm saying that because I'm here and that's...
No, and I think what I was going to say is I said the foreign policy of the Trump administration has been mostly continuity, but it's definitely true there have been some changes in emphasis. And Latin America has become, once again, a really big site for the kind of locus of U.S. imperialism's gaze.
More visible, at least, with Trump than because with Obama, a lot of bad things happen, but Obama is like the actor in the movie playing, which everyone loves, but he do everything, the bad thing, uncovered. And so I don't know.
No, exactly. Obama was frankly a much more effective imperialist. Trump is so disgusting. He's so rude. He's so racist.
He's more evidence, even for Chavistas like Cass, having Trump in the White House is better. I know that it's hard to, maybe for some people to understand that, but it's better than having Obama, because Obama is what we call in Venezuela tira la piedra y esconde la mano.
Okay.
So
throwing the stone and hiding your hand.
Something like that. So with Trump, it's evident. The guy do everything, and he's like a big elephant in a room full of glasses or something like that. He destroy everything while he's passing by. So, but in the case of Obama, it's different. So in that sense.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons that we kind of changed the focus of the Grayzone, and we're focusing a lot in Latin America because that's unfortunately where all the action's happening, and it's bad action. It's economic war, it's coup attempts, it's brutal sanctions, and
more direct actions from Washington, as you were saying, like the change of policy with Cuba, the direct aggression and sanctions against Venezuela. I mean, the reinstatement of the Monroe Doctrine, which they talk openly right now about it whenever they have a chance in Washington. So it makes sense.
Yeah, John Bolton, who's helping to lead a lot of these policies. Of course, this is the neoconservative national security advisor in the Trump administration, who was an architect of the Iraq War, which killed 1 million people. He has called for years for a war with Iran. He is one of the most out of control war hawks you can imagine. And John Bolton said in an interview, I'm quoting him exactly. He said, "We are not afraid of using the word Monroe Doctrine," which, by the way, is not one word, but it just shows how absurd. It's just they're blatantly neo-colonial. So we at the Grayzone have been focusing a lot, of course, on Venezuela. We've taken 2 trips here this year in 2019, and I've already spent almost 4 months, 3 months now, and
soon here in Venezuela, by the way.
yeah, I mean, I'll end up spending 4 or 5 months this year in Venezuela, which has been great.
Sorry for interrupting you, but that reminds me of something that we were talking enough about. How do you feel in terms of feeling threat by the U.S. administration when you go back to the... Can you tell us a little bit about that when you go back to the U.S.?
Yeah, it was really funny is, as a U.S. citizen, people frequently ask me, "Oh my God, how is it in Venezuela?" They think there's some kind of dystopian end of the world scenario. I'm like, no, actually things are fine. You know, there's economic issues because of the sanctions and embargo, of course, but there's peace. There's tranquility.
To survive, trying to do their stuff, yes.
But there's not a civil war. There's not nearly as much conflict as there was in the tiny country of Honduras when I was there, which is basically a U.S. colony. But you know, we don't have time to talk about that. But the thing is, what's wild is the only real issue that I or my colleagues and comrades have had here is with our own government, with the U.S. government. Yeah, so we published an article at the Grayzone. There was a group here, the Embassy Protection Collective, that protected the Venezuelan embassy in D.C. from being taken over by the right-wing opposition. And one of the members of this collective, who is a U.S. citizen but is also Nicaraguan, he's a dual U.S. Nicaraguan citizen, he was interrogated for hours upon returning to the airport. My colleague Anya Parmpol was also taken aside and interrogated when she returned to the U.S. And I of course, believe that I'm going to be interrogated. And what's wild is, you know, as a journalist, I know of other journalists, and there have been cases of journalists being forced to hand over their phone and computer and have everything copied by the government, which is an extreme violation of our constitutional rights, especially as a journalist. So thus far, I haven't had any issues because I haven't returned, but I mean, we'll see what happens.
Yes. And can you talk us about the projects that you have in mind with the website?
Absolutely. I mentioned we work with Aaron Mate, who is a great journalist. He used to be a presenter for years, a producer at Democracy Now!, which, you know, has moved right. And now he launched his own show. And it's an excellent show. It's called Pushback. You can find that at YouTube. You can find it at the Grayzone. And we have a lot of plans. I mean, a lot of reporting here from Venezuela still, reporting more from Honduras and Nicaragua. And I don't want to spoil some of the plans that are coming up, but I'll say my colleague Max Blumenthal is going to an unnamed country in the Middle East soon, which is going to be very interesting. And I anticipate a lot of hateful backlash from our trolls and haters, but they don't want us to do journalism. Because the thing is, and I'll just conclude here that, you know, we were talking about the importance of independent media, Orinoco Tribune, what we're doing, and I think independent media is winning, which is why I think there's such an intense backlash against alternative media outlets by these big tech companies, by Twitter.
Twitter, yes, I was about to mention
that are blocking and suspending and shadow banning.
I believe that there's going to be a big debate, not only among journalists, but among everyone. I mean, I believe that in the next few months or maybe years, if Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all those social media big corporations keep doing what they has been doing recently against Iran, China, Venezuela, and other countries around the world, people are gonna start realizing that their definition, at least of free press, is twisted. And I believe that eventually that's gonna backlash those corporations because people have the idea, and we know that that's not true, but people have the idea that those corporations spread like the truth or information or something like that. And if they attack everyone that says the opposite to the mainstream, at least in my opinion, that's gonna be the end of the game for those corporations. I don't know if you think the same way as I do, and I've been too optimistic or something like that.
No, I don't know. It's hard to say. The thing is, they maintain a monopoly on social media outlets. And I recently actually participated at Telesur. I participated in a debate in Spanish about the role of social media companies. Yeah, and it was on Texto y Contexto with Luis de Jesus. And the debate was about whether or not social media outlets, social media corporations play a role in overthrowing governments. And they certainly play a role, but what that role is. And the thing is, the point I was making in that debate is that there isn't an alternative in terms of platforms. There are alternatives that have been built, like your website, our website, to news outlets. But the thing is, the actual platforms for disseminating the information, these are controlled by a small handful of companies. So as an example, we have Facebook, but Facebook also owns WhatsApp, and Facebook owns Instagram. Instagram is extremely popular. We also see that Google owns YouTube, and then of course we have Twitter. So it's really three big companies that control all social media, major mainstream social media outlets. So I think what this ultimately comes down to is a question of regulation by the U.S. government, and we have some politicians who are proposing regulation, Tulsi Gabbard, Bernie Sanders, and others. And I think that's good. Regulation is good, but it's still regulation by the U.S. government. And the central contradiction is that these social media platforms are international. We're here in Venezuela.
Yes, even here in Venezuela, there are discussions about people connected to technology. And one of the discussions is that corporations, for example, in Venezuela, everyone uses Twitter. But whenever the guys on Twitter Latin America that are, I believe, that are based in Mexico, decided to close or ban or anything, any account, they just do it. And most of the time, they do it against progressive people or people connected to the government, or very rarely they do something against right-wingers or things like that. So in Venezuela, there's a lot of debate. There's maybe not a lot, but the issue is that because they are not based in Venezuela, the government sometimes feel that whatever legislation is imposed on those corporations won't have too much effect. I mean, at least in terms, I'm talking about, I know that regulations is not a word that sounds nice, but at least in terms of equity, I mean, you have to treat everyone the same way. You know what I mean? If you close an account of someone, you have to apply the same rules to everyone. So in that sense, regulation might be good, but even for Venezuela, if we want to do that, we won't be able to do it because of the cloudiness that surround the business. You know what I mean? I mean, they don't have, Twitter do not have an office in Venezuela. So it's I know that it's gonna take us to a very long discussions, but it's something that is out there, and a lot of people, not only in Venezuela but in different Latin American countries, have talked about that and how you can do stuff to exercise a little bit of sovereignty in relation to freedom of press in social media. So it's like a big debate.
That's what I was going to say, is that even if there is regulation by the U.S. government, it's still the U.S. government. Why should the U.S. government control these media platforms that are used by the entire world? And then this leads to a discussion of what are the alternative media, social media platforms. Well, the problem is, Russia has one, VK, but it's only really used by Russians. China has some, but it's really only used by Chinese. If we want to have these truly international social media platforms, who's going to regulate them? Why would the U.S. government and Silicon Valley be the ones chosen? That's not democratic. That's very authoritarian. So, I don't know the answer to these questions, and all I can say is that people are going to continue resisting and pushing back against the control that these corporations wield over the planet, and the control they have over information, because the point of alternative media is breaking the stranglehold that these 6 major corporations have over 95% of the news media in the US and other countries and much of the world. You have these media oligarchs throughout Latin America, these families that control, these right-wing families that control all the media apparatus. So it's going to be a constant struggle. But I think, and again, not to pretend like what we're doing is so amazing and incredible and toot our own horn, but I think we're following in the footsteps of past alternative media outlets that I look to for guidance. Things like in the US, there's so many cases, but things like Ramparts Magazine, things like I.F. Stone's weekly newsletter, these independent platforms that were built. And I think you're right that in the future, people have really lost faith in the dominant corporate media news platforms that have continued to sell lies to justify war after war, to justify whatever the 1% and capitalist class want this week. But the question is, how do we build alternatives to that? And I think, Venezuela actually, at a political level, is like the perfect symbol for the crisis, the systemic crisis, where everyone knows that the world is in this systemic economic and political crisis, and we need to build new institutions, but how do we build them? And Venezuela as a country is like a perfect metaphor for that struggle at a much higher level, at trying to build new institutions within the colonial Bretton Woods framework. So I think the media struggle is a big part of that larger political struggle, and the only answer is that the media climate can only change when the political climate changes and they reflect each other.
Now that you mentioned Venezuela, why don't we move forward to the other part of the interview that I want you. I basically want you to talk a little bit about your impressions on this in your trip to Venezuela. Your impressions on Venezuela right now.
Well, I was here in February and March, and I'll say that fortunately, I think it's actually a good sign. Things are the same. Things have not really changed. If anything, things might be a little easier. Of course, there are still difficulties. Some of the problems have been solved.
We have to recognize that you are coming like a foreigner, and sometimes you don't see what we were talking about, the economic struggle of most Venezuelans, and we might talk about that a little bit later. But yes, I share your opinion about that. Things are like normal.
And in the sense that, of course, it's clear that some Venezuelans are really suffering, and a lot of that is because of the U.S. economic warfare and sanctions. But in the sense that when I was here in February and March, the inflation hasn't changed that much, and that's a good thing, because this country's been, suffering from horrible inflation in recent years. So things are under control. And what really strikes me every time I'm here is the resilience of the Venezuelan people, and also the fact that Venezuelans know why they're being forced to suffer. They're not suffering. Of course, there are always the 20% of the population who are diehard anti-Chavista, and they think Maduro is responsible for every...
Yes. And they blame Maduro for the fire in Bolivia, in Brazil, and they blame Maduro for not having fires in the Amazon in Venezuela. And that happened. That's true. but
And their light bulb goes out, and they blame Maduro, and like they stub their toe, and they're like, "Maldito Maduro."
Maduro, yes, that's true. That's true. I mean, it's not an exaggeration. That's exactly the way it happened here. I mean, that reminds me a lot with the blackouts, and whenever we had the blackouts here, that I truly believe that are connected with the unconventional war that the U.S. applying on Venezuela.
And there's a lot of evidence. There's a lot of evidence.
Blackouts that happened in Argentina a few weeks ago, or in the U.S. a few weeks ago also, and no one and when I saw the news in those countries, I say about that no one says anything about Macri or about Trump. No one blames them, and here in Venezuela, everyone immediately after one of those blackouts blame Maduro. So it's kind of
Yeah, I mean, I live part of the time in New York, and there was a massive blackout in New York City. There was also a massive blackout in London. These are two of the richest cities on planet Earth, and no one blames capitalism.
Exactly. But anyway, that we understand that that's part of the campaign and the media campaign of discrediting Venezuela, the Bolivarian Revolution, Chavismo, and whatever smells socialism. That's how it is.
Yeah, so to answer your question more, I also am always struck, people when I say this, they think that it's just me speaking from my ideology, but it's 100% a reflection of the reality I always see here is that Chavismo is still a very working class movement. It is absolutely...
And it's alive. And we were talking a few minutes ago off camera about the complex economic situation that we are facing because in recent weeks the devaluation of the Bolivar and the increase in prices is driving us crazy, most of the regular, ordinary Venezuelans. But that's one thing. And stop being Chavista is another thing. You know what I mean? I mean, the Chavismo is something that go beyond that, and I believe that connects with what you were mentioning about the resilience and that kind of stuff, because it's like something that evolves and adapts to the whatever circumstances we face, and that's good from one side, but of course I believe that it might have its limits, if I don't know, but the fact is that Chavismo is vivito y coleando, as we say in Venezuela, and the spirit of the Chavistas in order to resist this aggression, if you ask me, I believe that is still the same. Disregarding that there's a lot of stress among most of the Venezuelans, disregarding they are Chavistas or not, because of the economic situation, economic crisis, that is in a lot of ways responsibility of the U.S. aggression, the U.S. embargo, the sanctions, the blockade, and everything. But also, I believe that is also there is some sort of responsibility from the government, and the government have to recognize. We published something by a very nice writer called Negron. He writes usually every week in Sputnik, and he was like recommending the government, why don't we do like a balance sheet in which we can clearly identify which things are really consequence. I mean, from the things that affects the Venezuelan day-to-day life, like identifying which one is connected directly with the U.S. imperialism, and the ones that are connected to inefficiency, corruption, and those things that happen, and like it happens in everywhere in the world. But and I believe that was a nice proposal, because that will help the government try to fight against demoralization of the Chavista, forces that at some point might happen. I don't feel that is happening right now, but at some point might happen, because if the economic situations keep, getting worse. I don't know what you think about that.
No, yeah, and there's a lot to say. I mean, all I'll say is that the economic situation is hard to parse out for a foreigner, right? And I don't need to comment on the nuances and subtleties of the economic policies of the Venezuelan government when we know the elephant in the room, the most significant factor is the illegal embargo that the U.S. government has imposed. And no government is perfect, and of course, I'm sure they've made mistakes, but those mistakes, I think, are a tiny factor compared to the fact that it has become illegal, essentially, for any company in the entire world to do business with the Venezuelan government. They face the threat of secondary sanctions by the U.S., which is the most powerful economic, political, military power in the world. And this is an oil exporting country. This is a petrostate. It has been for nearly 100 years, and this is not something unique to Chavismo. So all I'll say is that it's absolutely true that I'm always struck. It's actually not a reflection of my ideology. It's actually something that frankly surprises me because I know it's true, but just how true every time I interact with poor and working class Venezuelans, they're basically all Chavistas. And the people, it's just fair to say that the opposition are the middle and upper class, and working class and poor people are diehard Chavistas. I know that, but every time I talk to someone, it just becomes more and more confirmed. The people who are suffering the most from the embargo and the U.S. sanctions are the ones who support the government the most. And the people who...
Sounds like kind of crazy because the right-wingers, the middle class or the upper middle class, they are the ones that still have ways to have an earning in dollars, or they have relative, or they have wealth that they accumulate before. So they are the less affected. They are affected, of course, but they are the less affected by the economic situation in Venezuela, and they keep traveling abroad whenever they want. They can keep doing the same things that they usually do. But it's true that the ones that are more affected are the poor ones, the Chavistas, which...
And also, it's always just so striking the political ideological development, which is a reflection of the revolution, the revolutionary gains. It's not just a gain in terms of material victories, but also ideological ones where the population is so ideologically developed and advanced, and people understand how imperialism functions. They understand what the IMF is. They understand that the petrodollar maintains its chokehold on the global economy. These are issues that even PhD economists in the US who have been inculcated in a neoliberal ideology, they never talk about, and it doesn't interest them. And so, for instance, you'll hear people talk about multilateralism, the importance of a multipolar world, the importance of creating an economy that isn't just based on one currency like the US dollar, but on the Chinese yuan and the Turkish lira and all these other currencies. I mean, people understand and have been politicized and educated through the revolution. And all I'll say, I guess the final thing I'll say is that...
Also in the media,
the media narrative is...
We in Venezuela are vaccinated for biased media or for right-wing media. I don't know if you get the idea that...
Vaccinated against media bias.
We have been passing through too many different media obstacles starting since Hugo Chavez's campaign in 98 and having the first big explosion in the 2002 coup d'etat against Chavez that was led by the media. So we have been evolving, and I live, as you know, in the US for several years, and people in the US believe in the media.
Well, the thing is...
I think that's changing, but here in Venezuela, that's completely the opposite, because we have been living through media craziness. So
I think you're definitely right that people here have a very justified and very important and impressive skepticism of corporate media narratives. I think in the U.S., people are very skeptical and suspicious, and polls show that most U.S. people have no faith in the corporate media. The thing, though, is very few people have another vision of something better, because the U.S. is actually such a deeply apolitical, depoliticized society, which is a reflection, actually, of how authoritarian the U.S. government is and the U.S. system is. where they feel powerless. They feel there's no alternative. They've been told their entire lives there is no alternative to the hellish neoliberal dystopia that we live in, where people have there's trillions of dollars of student debt, where people can't afford healthcare and they go bankrupt, or people who have cancer lose their homes because they can't afford treatment. So the situation is different, but what I was going to say, another thing that's really striking to me every time I'm here, and this, the revolution has obtained a lot, but it has always been a revolution that has worked within the confines of a bourgeois democratic system. It has never been anything. It's extremely democratic, and in many ways people would see that as something very positive, but what it also means is that, unlike in Cuba, where in Cuba they had a revolution, they overthrew the capitalist class and took their property and nationalized it. There still is a very strong capitalist class here in Venezuela that's very parasitic, that doesn't produce anything really, and that lives very nice lives. And every time I'm in Chacao and the eastern part of Caracas and the rich areas, it's just always so striking to me that there actually is a big class divide, and it's not the government, it's not Chavismo's fault for this class divide. This is
sometimes they say that those that live well are what they call the bourgeoisie, which is a big myth that they are created, if you ask me. I'm not saying that they are not. They should be a lot of businessmen connected with Chavismo, with the government. I'm not saying that do not happen, but if you ask me about percentages, I don't think that they represent more than 2% or 3% of all the rich guys that you might see in the east of Caracas. So it's like a big myth that they has been creating for years about the bourgeoisie and whatever, which is...
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that, what's so funny is in the U.S. there's this vision that Venezuela is this communist dictatorship, and actually it's so democratic that, frankly, this is my personal view, it's too democratic. I think they allow the opposition to get away with so many acts of sabotage that hurt the entire population. So many
walking around for several months without putting him in jail is crazy.
Yeah. So anyway, one of the things that I know it, but every time I see it again, I'm always just so surprised by how well and how nicely and luxuriously the right-wing opposition, the elites, live here in Venezuela. They actually have extremely nice lives, just like people in Miami. Their lives are not that different, and it's actually a reflection of how committed the government has been to preserving democracy in this country.
Yes, that's true. Let's talk about the last thing that we wanted to talk, which is the new trends. What you foresee, that is coming in terms of media trends.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things happening. Well, in terms of overall trends, it's obvious that corporate media monopolies, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, these are dying out, and there's a new generation of media, but many of these new so-called independent outlets are actually being absorbed by the massive companies. And it's actually very similar to what happened with record labels. So at first with the creation of the record and the CD and recorded music as an industry, there were all these big record labels that dominated the industry. And then you had the rise of small independent record labels that were publishing independent music, and then slowly they got bought out and eaten up by all the massive conglomerates. It's the same thing happening with media. Vice Media is a perfect example of this. Vice has essentially become an extension of like CNN and all these horrible corporate media outlets.
At the beginning, they portrayed themselves like liberals, even socialists. I had some friends in the U.S. that at the beginning they were like eating everything from Vice, but no, they
yeah, and anyone interested in seeing Vice's evolution, Max Blumenthal and I have a 2-part podcast episode at our podcast Moderate Rebels detailing how it went from this punk underground magazine in Canada, and then has become a media empire that propagandizes for the U.S. empire. One of the co-founders, Shane Smith, is a billionaire now. They had a massive deal with HBO. They have massive capital investment from venture capital funds from Wall Street. They have partial ownership by Rupert Murdoch of Fox News, partial ownership by Disney. So I think, to answer your question, is where it's going in the future, is that these kinds of new, cool, sexy, independent media outlets are going to maintain that branding, but ideologically, they're just going to echo the same corporate media outlets and even be owned by the same corporate media outlets that still dominate the media landscape.
But in terms of news, I mean, what I was trying to ask you was in terms of news about, for example, the Amazon fires and that kind of, things that I believe are going to ring tail. I don't know if you say that exactly that way in English, but these events that we are seeing in the Amazon are gonna bring news in the next few months. How do you see it?
Well, one of the things about the Amazon fires is, of course, it's very clear that the fascist leader of Brazil, who was installed thanks to the U.S.-backed coup against the Workers' Party and Lula and Dilma, Jair Bolsonaro, it's clear that these are intentional. And we actually now have leaked documents from the Brazilian government that show that Bolsonaro, his administration, knew that capitalists were going to be burning parts of the Amazon to destroy the land, and they were fine with it. So obviously it got out of control. And one of the narratives we're seeing weaponized is this narrative against Evo Morales, the democratically elected government of Bolivia. So there have been coups and elections, often rigged elections, that ousted progressive leaders throughout Latin America. One of the only remaining countries with Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua is Bolivia. And in Bolivia, there's now this massive propaganda campaign against Evo, who's extremely popular, but there are these U.S.-funded regime change groups, the fake leftist opposition, even indigenous groups that are trying to claim, like Evo, who's the first indigenous leader of Bolivia's history, is somehow anti-indigenous. So I think that's going to be a big part of it. But once again, these media narratives, they just reflect the prerogatives and priorities of the U.S. government. So now that the election's coming up in Bolivia, we're going to see a rise in propaganda against Evo. And there's an election coming up.
By the way, is the only president that I seen that took immediate actions, right? I mean, the plane that he leased and moving all the cabinet to the border to force them to deal with the crisis is like no one. I mean, and those fires has been affecting several countries in South America. So I believe that trend is crazy, but it's true that it's happening. Also here in Venezuela, there are some guys that has been talking again in the midst of these fires about Arco Minero, which is this massive program from the government that is trying to put order in the exploitation of minerals in the south side of Venezuela. So I believe that also talking about those trends, news that are gonna come in the near future, they are gonna try to attack Maduro through that. I don't know what you think about it.
No, it's clear. I mean, it's very clear that the coup has failed. The coup attempt with Juan Guaidó totally failed. The three military coup attempts in February 23rd, March, and then April 30th all failed completely. And now the narrative is going to be about, the media narrative is going to be blaming the government for the humanitarian crisis. And to the extent that there is a so-called humanitarian crisis, it's going to be problems caused by the embargo and the economic warfare. So, for instance, we saw a report, a very important report that got no mainstream coverage, by the Center for Economic and Policy Research, two world-leading economists, Jeffrey Sachs, a world-renowned Columbia University scholar, and Mark Weisbrot, a leading expert in Venezuela's economy. Both of them found that due to U.S. sanctions, from mid 2017 to the end of 2018, so in a year and a half, the U.S. sanctions on Venezuela led to the excess preventable deaths of more than 40,000 Venezuelans. That is a conservative estimate. And that's genocidal warfare by the U.S. against the entire civilian population. To the extent that is covered in corporate media, it's always portrayed as something that the government is responsible for. Like, the government is starving Venezuelans, the regime, blah, blah, blah. So we're going to see more of that.
Narco.
Yeah, and
Narco traffic and Tarek El Alsami. I believe that they're going to try also to, dig there again.
yeah, and meanwhile, Uribe, the most powerful Colombian leader, a major U.S. ally, we all have known for decades that he's been involved with actual narcos and cartels. And then, of course, a U.S. federal judge recently named the president of Honduras, the dictator of Honduras, who stole the last election.
The problem is here in Venezuela.
Of course, they named him as a co-conspirator in dealing drugs and using the drug money to rig the election. Anyway, the point is, the propaganda narratives are going to change. But I'll say there's one other final thing. Those narratives change, but they always maintain the same thrust of anti-Venezuela propaganda. There's something new and frankly even more dangerous. And I'll conclude on this because it's something that's going to impact not just the next year or two, but the rest of our lives. And that is that the Trump administration has continued, once again, a policy laid out by the Obama administration, but has pushed it really into a new economic war with China. And I think the new Cold War with Russia, which is absolutely real, this whole Russiagate obsession, this idea that Putin is under your bed.
In the U.S. for, I don't know, for like 5 or 10 years. So right now we are seeing the fruit of that.
Since the Russian government, regardless of what you think about its character, since a new government came to power that was independent from what Washington wanted, because they had the years of Yeltsin where Washington just controlled Russia's foreign policy. Now they have an independent government that just doesn't bow to Washington's diktat. But what I was going to say is, that's a real Cold War. I mean, and it's very real, and it's going to impact the upcoming decades. But I actually think that it pales in comparison to the Cold War with China. And the U.S. Cold War is not just a Cold War on Russia. It's a Cold War against both Russia and China. But I actually think if you talk to policymakers in Washington, and not just Washington, in London, in Paris, what they're really afraid of is China and the rise of China, this country that was the largest country in the world, which was colonized for 200 years by Western colonialists, has not only freed itself from the yoke of Western colonial oppression since the 1949 revolution, but has also now ascended to becoming what will soon be the world's largest economic power. The crisis ideologically and politically within the U.S. government is difficult to overstate, not just from Trump. There are so many liberals who are 100% on board with the anti-China propaganda war that's coming, the information war that has begun. So I think the corporate media narratives, more and more, it's going to be about how China is responsible for the fires in the Amazon, which is one of the latest talking points. How China...
I have read information about that.
Yeah, of course, there's no mention of Bolsonaro. China is responsible for the economic crash. China is responsible for this and this and this. And the last thing I'll say is that what I'm worried about is that there is a growing leftist movement in the U.S. with people like Bernie Sanders. But what it seems like more and more is that there is a concerted attempt by the U.S. national security state, intelligence agencies, large corporations, politicians from the Republican and Democratic parties. There's a concerted attempt by all of them to unite the extremely fractured political factions and classes in the U.S., to unite them all on lines against China. And not just, but actually, of course, the Russia stuff has been there, but it's China, because the thing about Russia...
It's crazy, because I believe that the U.S. is the one that have more to lose in that at least economic war, trade war, or however you want to call it. So, I, in relation to what you are saying, I don't see the U.S. economy improving too much in the next few years. Only, I mean, just because of that narrative and that trend that they are imposing against China and portraying China like the big new enemy of the world.
Yeah, so I'll say is that the left in the U.S. has been better on Venezuela than on other issues like Syria. It's been awful on. Nicaragua was awful on. Because the neo-colonial coup attempt was so blatant against Venezuela, people kind of understood what was happening. Now, I think the most dangerous upcoming threat is that I'm afraid that some of the new so-called democratic socialist types are going to unite with the right against China and portray China as the new threat to the so-called rules-based democratic order. So I'll just conclude by saying Venezuela has clearly survived the coup attempt, and now it's going to be a matter of surviving siege warfare, a medieval siege warfare by the U.S. empire. And maybe countries like China can actually help Venezuela out of that. Meanwhile, I think the upcoming decades of our lives are going to be really determined by a growing international Cold War. And this new Cold War is the U.S. against Russia again, but really against China.
That's nice. I didn't saw about that much, but it's true. Everything that you say is true. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Ben, for being with us, and I hope to do something like this again soon.
Yeah. Ojalá.
Bye bye. Thank you guys for listening.
Yeah.
Bye.